Hello all, welcome to EIG and Upwork's Rise of Remote series first webinar focused on exploring trends in remote work post-COVID. We are going to give attendees just a second and we'll get started. All right. Well, hello again, and welcome to the first of 3 events in the Economic Innovations Group's Rise of Remote series in partnership with Upwork. I'm Molla. I'm the Chief of Staff at EIG and want to thank you so much for being with us today. We are exploring trends in remote work post-pandemic. And as you all know, the COVID-19 public health crisis pushed approximately half of the American workforce out of their physical offices and into the remote at an unprecedented speed. And while the shift to remote has been gradually underway, the rapid acceleration of telework over the pandemic represents one of the most drastic shifts our workforce has seen. Vaccines are being rolled out across the country, and employers are exploring return, remote, and hybrid options. And so our inaugural session in the Rise of Remote series will explore whether the shift to remote during the pandemic is temporary or whether it's here to stay and can be harnessed to advance a more equitable geography in the United States. Our speakers will explore the implications of the rise of remote for the US economy and for our longstanding economic divides. And they'll discuss what is needed to ensure that communities large and small can attract workers and build communities for them to live, work, and gather for the long term. First, we'll hear from Richard Florida in a pre-recorded conversation with EIG's President and CEO, John Lettieri. Then we'll transition to the live panel portion of our webinar with guest speakers Adam Ozimek of Upwork, Arpit Gupta of New York University's Stern School of Business, Julia Pollak of ZipRecruiter, Matthew Kahn of Johns Hopkins University, moderated by Rani Molla of Recode. We hope to have a couple of minutes towards the end of the webinar for our live panel to answer audience questions. So please submit those via the Q&A function, not the chat box. This webinar is being recorded and we will post the recording on our website afterward. And so without further ado, we'll get started by hearing from Richard Florida and John Lettieri.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is John Lettieri. I'm the President and CEO of the Economic Innovation Group. We're very pleased to be joined today by a special guest, Richard Florida. As so many of you know, Richard is a renowned urbanist, a professor at the University of Toronto, and the author of several best-selling books, including The Rise of the Creative Class. So we're excited to have Richard with us for this first Rise of Remote event. Richard, thank you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, John. And you know I'm a huge fan of the Institute and all the work you do. So it's a delight to be with you today.
Thank you. The feeling's mutual. So let's dive in with the creative class. Who are they and how are they relevant to this conversation about remote work?
You know, it's so funny that you asked this. We have not, folks, we have not talked about this in advance. You know, I've been thinking that in a way, I've been introspecting for a long time. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? What did I miss? And the one thing that I talked about was the creative class was a group of knowledge workers. And I think what I added to that initial group of professionals and techies and entrepreneurs and innovators and managers, I kind of said, add in the entertainers and the artists and the musicians, everyone who kind of works with their mind. And then you get the creative class, about 1/3 of the workforce. And in big cities, maybe 45 or 50% of the workers. But anyway, in that book now 20 years ago, I said that the balance of power, if you will, was shifting away from the people who own the means of production at the margin, the capital, to talent, to these, not to labor per se, because there are a lot of labor folks who are just screwed, in this world, but to these talented group, there was a focus on talent, and for economic development, you no longer wanted to go after the big company with the big incentive award. You try to attract the talented people, and it's like when COVID hit, that balance shifted even further. That we began to see that talent with remote work, I think this is really interesting. Something I never thought about, right? I mean, I've been a remote worker most of my career, but there's like 4 or 5% of us worked remotely. Now where you've got now 20, 25% of people, even more during but over maybe 50% of the people workers working remote during the crisis, now shaking out to 20 or 25%, it really shifts the balance of power to talent and to what that remote worker wants. So in a way, it's kind of came full circle. I mean, that's what's so funny to me. It came full circle where this creative class or talented worker can at least at the margin control the terms of their work. And I think remote work is a big part of that.
We know that the creative class has been increasingly clustered in those superstar cities that we hear so much about. So how will the rise of remote work affect those superstar cities that have so far in the 21st century really been dominating the economy? And what, if anything, worries you in terms of how these trends are going to affect those cities?
What a great question. And I think, when the crisis struck, right, there was the death of cities, the end, and we heard that end of New York refrain. I mean, look, I've heard it 3 or 4 times in the past 20 years, and it's always wrong. So the first thing I'm going to say is that places like New York and San Francisco will be just fine, but they'll be really different. I think, those of us who are our age, have families, have a lot more options. We can move, and I think the big thing is we're not just to the next door suburb. Like my dad, who worked in a factory in Newark, when I was 2 and my brother was a bun in the oven, they moved from Newark to a nearby suburb called North Arlington. If you worked in New York or Chicago or San Francisco and Boston, and you had kids and you needed more space, you moved to the next suburb. Now I think for older folks with kids, they can move, and I think the biggest shift has been out to the kind of exurbs in rural areas. Like if you look at the change, the big change numbers, they're like the Hudson Valley towns outside of New York or the Hamptons or the equivalent places in San Francisco. But then, you could also work remotely if you're full-time remote. You have to be full-time remote. You can go to a cheaper city. And some of that's been how I'll come back to it. I think the big, and then cities, I think, are just getting younger. We're seeing now record leasing. Of course, prices are down in New York, but it's young people. If you're young, if you're post-college, if you want to get that good job in finance or real estate or management or in tech in San Francisco or entertainment in Hollywood, or in policy, right? DC's where you live has always been a young city. You got to go to that superstar cities to start off your career. And then when family comes, you move. I think the other shift, which is a little bit less, is that there is a group of the rise of the rest that have become marginally more attractive. Now, and some of them we know. Austin, well, ever since I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, it's been the second dominant tech hub for talent to San Francisco 20 years ago. Miami, where I spend the winters, which has been, if you ask me what's my biggest surprise, Miami's rise as a finance, a real estate, but also a tech center. That's a big surprise to me. And then the Pittsburghs, the Nashvilles, you know them, and then the Bozeman's, the Park Cities, the kind of beautiful places. But I also think there have been these very proactive places, like the Tulsas of the world. They had that Tulsa remote program before the crisis, and they put their flag up. And then I think people said, well, yeah. And we know now that these places that have remote worker programs, they've tended to get a lot of applications because people are just, they see it and they go, well, that's something I should consider, and they're interested in me. So yeah, I think we are seeing some shift, but it's not this wholesale new geography. I think the shifts are very subtle and nuanced, and they're a lot to do with age and demography as well as place.
You hear a lot about how remote work could be a boon to struggling places, or if the economic geography flattens a bit and areas that are second or third tier and struggling to keep up with some of the more top tier cities in this country, if they lean into it, as Tulsa has and others, that this can somehow be a game changer for struggling areas of the country. Are you skeptical of that notion? I mean, how many of the winners are going to be areas that were struggling prior to the pandemic, but see remote work as the key to unlocking a different kind of economic future?
I wouldn't say I'm skeptical of it. I just wouldn't oversell it. I think if you look at the struggling places that would really benefit, it's the rural areas outside of superstar cities. I mean, the Hudson Valleys, the areas of Pennsylvania around Allentown and those parts, the Catskills, and I hate to keep going back to New York, but I'm from Newark and I lived in New York and I went to graduate school. So that's the place I know the best. You could just see that there, people are saying, yeah, the suburbs and the suburbs are gaining. But boy, if I could live in the Hudson Valley and be on the waterfront, or if I could live in the Catskills, and then, maybe I commute in one day a week or one day a month, I think those are the kind of lagging places. And our good friend, Adam Ozimek, he's talked a lot about his part of Pennsylvania, and I think he's right about it, that they've seen huge gains and there's more that they can gain. I think, I was a critic, folks, I was a critic of the Amazon HQ2 incentives. But I'll tell you, I think Amazon HQ2 did like one of the best location searches. I've been in this field for 40 years. I think if you look at that finalist list, of Amazon's finalist list, and of course, New York was on there, in Newark, and DC, and the suburbs of DC. But then you go down and you find Indianapolis, Columbus, Dallas, Miami, Austin, Nashville. You look, Pittsburgh, Denver, you look at that finalist list, and boy, that really looks to me like the places that can super capitalize, that were already kind of doing well enough and already rise of the rest, to use Steve Case's phrase. And then I think the other places that can do well are the super intentional, you said it, the super intentional places that aren't just letting it flow to them, but are saying, we want to make a go for these remote workers, and we're going to do everything we can to put it on their radar screen. I just want to say, I think Adam's right, that the biggest gain will be in the rural or exurban fringe adjacent to an existing labor market. So the metropolitan area boundary will grow. And let me say this to folks. I was just up in northern Michigan. My wife's from Michigan, from some of the Detroit suburbs. We took a trip up to Traverse City, in that area. We met and ran into a lot of remote workers up there, but they were mainly from Detroit. Did that make sense? Yeah, there were a couple people from New York and a few people from Chicago. But in a way, I think the biggest beneficiaries of the shift to remote work are going to be the people at the places at the periphery, the Traverse cities or the Hudson Valley, New York, that used to be a resort destinations that now become work destinations.
So you mentioned the intentionality that some cities have shown. How should we think about remote work as an economic development tool? What should places that are on that bubble actually be doing to lean into this trend?
Well, I've been studying the organization of work since the 1980s. My initial research before I started working on the creative class was on the organization of work in high performance factories in the Rust Belt. So I started studying the Japanese factories, the German factories, the transplants, what was happening on the organization of work in the factory floor. Remote work is a big shift in the organization of work. I mean, it's one of the biggest shifts that I've seen in the organization of knowledge work, right? The use of digital tools and technologies. So I think this is a major, this is one of the massive shifts in the organization of work and in the spatial allocation of the organization in the history of modern capitalism, knowledge capitalism. I think there's a couple things. One, I think it's not the money. I understand why the incentive is there, the 10,000 or whatever it is, and it's a signal. And I encourage everyone I consult a little with the Kaiser Family Foundation that did Tulsa Remote. I consult a little bit with the Walton Family Foundation that did the Northwest Arkansas program. And I say, don't think about that as an incentive. Think about that as a moving an office setup, right? That's the cost of a move and office setup, and it's offsetting that. But focus on the other parts. And the other parts I think that matter is this peer group. I think that remote workers want to know that they're going to a place where they can have a community of other professionals like them. And then the second thing is to focus on building community connections. I think that's what the Tulsa program has done very well as I've gotten to know it. They really help the remote workers not only become a community of remote workers, but become part of the Tulsa community. And if you read the interviews that have been done, people say, well, I moved from San Francisco or New York from Tulsa. And what I liked about it is I was no longer in my blue bubble. I was actually in a community of people that were different than me. And I think people are looking to make these moves. I consider myself one of them, are actually looking for a place that's much more balanced, where they can get out of their own just bubble. And then I think the thing that they haven't done, that I think is the next frontier, is really how do you build the ecosystem of remote work? You know, I'm here talking to you from a Zoom studio that I had an unemployed AV guy help me cobble together with a microphone, a webcam, and a light, and a green screen. Well, most people don't know how to do that. So how do you kind of help them set up their digital technology? But moreover, you know, if you look at Adam's work and other survey work, you know, most remote work doesn't go on just in a house, in a home office. I think about a quarter of it or more goes on in a coffee shop or a library or a co-working space, or with the one that was interesting was somebody else's house. So I think the next frontier is trying to figure out what is that ecosystem of remote work that's better than getting a table at Starbucks, or better than, you know, going to the local library, or better than going to your friend's house, or what. I think we need a lot more thought and action about building remote work ecosystems. And I want to echo this. Part of that can be done in a really interesting city, like a small city like Pittsburgh or Tulsa, or because those places are more affordable. So you can have more coffee shops and more interesting restaurants and more localized co-working spaces. But I also think you can build them out in remote areas. Like, I don't think they just have to be in urban areas. You can actually build them in rural areas. And one of the things that's very encouraging to me as I go around the country, there are a lot of people who want to do this. Like, when I talk to people, they're like, you know, I'd really like to build a boutique hotel in my town. And in that boutique hotel, I'd like to have co-working space. And in that thing, I'd like to have a place for remote workers to work. So people are thinking about this. And I think thinking through that remote work ecosystem is the most important thing folks can do.
This will be our last question, and I want to end on some prognostication and some debunking, if we can. One is you talked about how this was the biggest shift in the organization of work since you've been studying this topic. What's the most profound thing that you think will emerge from this as this trend becomes more solidified over time? And two, what do you think is the biggest misconception so far about the trend itself?
So a couple things. One, that it's a panacea. I think that's the biggest misconception. I think that remote work, that there's a couple of big issues that what it does in many ways is exacerbate existing class or socioeconomic or racial divides. Now, I don't have the exact statistics in front of me, but I do have them. White professional knowledge workers are many more times more likely to have the privilege of working remotely than minority essential workers. So somebody who's white with a college degree and works in a professional occupation just has so much more opportunity than somebody who's a member of a minority group, has a high school degree. And that gap between the two is growing. And that I think is the big one. The gap, that remote work increases the gap that we've seen, that your work and the Institute has done so many important studies of. I think the other thing is that you could see among some companies, not all companies, a kind of race to the bottom with remote work, where some companies say, you know, if you're going to move from San Francisco or New York or Washington, D.C., we're going to pay you a heck of a lot less because your housing costs are a lot less. And I think what really interesting communities like Tulsa are beginning to think about, I find is fascinating, is like, what would a remote worker bill of rights be? So what would be a set of protections, reasonable protections, for remote workers? The right to work, you know, in a quality environment, the right to work and, you know, at a good salary, and all of this. So the other one that I think is another issue is that you get this kind of local versus cosmopolitan split that we've seen in many other things. You know, when people see remote workers come in, and I would say this is even more of an issue in a Traverse City or a Hudson Valley, in the rural hinterlands outside a superstar city or a big city, than it is in a place like Tulsa or Pittsburgh or Nashville or Bentonville that are gaining remote workers. You get a kind of us versus them mentality. People are like, well, what are we doing attracting all of these fancy city people? And these fancy city, you know, if you're moving from New York to Hudson Valley, if you're moving from San Francisco to a rural area outside of San Francisco, you know, you'll pay more just because you've cashed out of your house. You're used to paying so much more. So the remote work shift is driving up housing prices. And I do think that has something to do with rising housing prices in America. It's not the only cause. But the fact that people can work remotely and are moving from high cost locations to lower cost locations, either in their same metropolitan area or in a new city, So yeah, I think those are the big ones. I think, look, the other one I didn't talk about, which apologies, I think the big negative impact for superstar cities is not going to be a massive loss of people. They will lose some high net worth people and they will lose some professional workers, but there'll be a slew of young people moving in. The central business district of major cities is going to be reshaped in a really powerful way. The idea that these knowledge workers are going to continue to get, drive to the train, take the train to the subway, take the subway and then walk to work and spend 2 to 3 hours of their daily lives, that's just nonsense. And so I think there's going to be the biggest impact of remote work is not going to be on the composition of cities' population. It's going to be on the composition of where people work. And I think less work is going to happen in the central business district. More work is going to happen outside of the central business district, some of it in homes and some of them in kind of revamped remote work ecosystems in suburbs and in rise of the rest places.
Richard, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank all of you for joining us today for this first Rise of Remote event.
Thank you so much. I hope you all enjoyed that conversation. A big thanks to Richard Florida and his team in helping to make that all happen. I will now turn it over to Rani Molla, our moderator for our esteemed panel, to take it away from here.
Thanks so much. I'm very excited to be here moderating today. So Richard went over quite a bit of this, but I figure you guys would have a little bit different answers, and maybe there's not just one answer to this sort of thing. So before we start, I want a lay of the land. Before the pandemic, only a small but growing segment of the population, something in the single digits, was able to work from home. Now there's a whole bunch of estimates as to how many people will be able to do so afterwards. If one or two of you want to speak up and say what you think, how many people will work from home when this is over, and who they are. I'm sure Adam or Julia.
Sure, I'll jump in.
Thanks.
I think pre-pandemic, probably it's something like 3 to 5% of people working from home full time, if you're talking about wage and salary workers. But then you also had people who were working remotely but not at home, and you also had self-employed workers and freelancers who are working remotely that aren't always captured in the same data set. So I think probably between 5 to 8% overall were working remotely full time. And I think we're probably still at about 25%, maybe 30% full-time remote. I think when it settles down, we're going to be down around 20%. So from 5 to 8 up to 20. And then when you're talking about part-time remote workers, I think that would be another 15% or so. So I think about 35% working from home sometime, and then the mix between there, I think between full-time and remote will be a little more uncertainty there.
Julia, 1 second.
So, that's exactly right. There are all these different surveys that show different things, but I think the question is what will happen going forward. And our data at ZipRecruiter really suggest that much of the growth in remote work will be sustained for a couple of reasons. The first is worker preferences. So every month we've been asking the same question, which is, would you prefer to get a job that allows you to work from home? And more than 50% of active job seekers right now say that they would prefer a remote job. It started off at around 68% who said they wanted a remote job now. It fell to about 56%, and it's rising again. And then we also asked people, would you like a remote job even after the pandemic ends? That started off at around 46% in January. It fell to around 43%, but it's also ticking up again at around 45%. So there is sustained interest in remote work, not just now, but even after the pandemic. And the other reason I think this will continue is not just because workers want it, but because there are all kinds of benefits for employers. So the big story right now is that there are worker shortages everywhere. There's a labor shortage. Well, there's no worker shortage for remote jobs. There were very healthy numbers of applications per posting, both due to the wider eligibility of candidates and because of worker preferences. All the barriers that we see to going back to a traditional sort of workplace-bound job, like concerns about COVID risk and childcare challenges, reluctance to use public transit, difficulty finding an affordable used car. All of those kinds of issues are just less of a problem for remote workers. And that's why we see sort of stronger, more robust, healthy numbers of applicants for those jobs right now.
So you see the remote work is actually a solve to all of the jobs that aren't filled right now. Is there sort of a misalignment though between the jobs that are empty and the skill sets of those who are able to work remotely?
Yes, so in our surveys, the people who most say that they would like remote work are women and African Americans, and they also tend to be underrepresented in the industries where remote work is most prevalent. So, hopefully there'll be some movement towards bridging that gap. I still think that remote work will be hugely beneficial towards women. Study upon study showed that women have a higher willingness to pay for remote work, but don't necessarily get more remote opportunities, or at least didn't before the pandemic. I do think now that there'll be some sort of natural sorting into remote jobs among the people who most value those opportunities. I know, expecting my third child in a matter of weeks, that I'm really, really happy to be having a baby after the pandemic rather than before the pandemic, because it's not going to be obvious to anyone in the office that I'm out of the office, for months at a time. Everyone's working from home most of the time. Coming into the office, 1 or 2 days a week, I think will become the norm at our company and at many other companies. And that I think will be really liberating to a lot of working mothers who will finally be able to have it all.
Does anyone else want to chime in on that before I move on? Okay, so we have this new group of people or newly enabled group of people going to be working from home. Obviously, there's a lot of possibilities there. I want to talk a little bit about where exactly they're moving. I'm pretty sure since like the advent of the modern internet, people have been threatening to, work from anywhere. That hasn't really happened, try as we might, like it didn't happen in any like meaningful way. It was growing, but now it's sort of like, this is the time when a much bigger percentage of the population can do this. Where are they going? And there's a few different answers to this, so I would love to have many of you chime in. Maybe we'd start with Arpit.
Yeah, so in our research, we kind of looked at migration rates in conjunction with patterns for housing and rents. And what we find is, kind of consistent with what Richard was saying. The initial phase of migration was really within city, meaning that it's people kind of moving from the urban center towards the suburbs. And I think that's kind of really happening in a time when there's a lot of uncertainty or there's a lot of risk about what future working from home practices are going to look like, right? So if you're kind of thinking of a future in which you might be in the office 2 days a week, 3 days a week, you're not quite sure what the long-term equilibrium is going to be, you don't necessarily want to depart from the MSA entirely because there's a risk that you'll be kind of stranded. I think the other risk people are really worried about is what is the national market for remote work going to look like? If I move to a remote area, am I really going to be able to pick up other opportunities if I sever the tie to my original employer? And so I think for these reasons, a lot of the movement and activity has been kind of in the periphery of the cities, again, as Richard was saying, or potentially to some of these kind of high amenity destinations, the ski resort, places and so on and so forth. I think the next wave of migration that we're going to be seeing in the coming years, I think, my guess is that that's going to be more to other destination areas, places that have a lot of amenities and cultural attractions, as well as places that can offer lower cost of living and more affordable living situations.
So for now, you're saying it's this like tentative wait and see, because we're not exactly sure what would happen. So move close to the city, and later on they might be a little more adventurous.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Rani, I want to pick up on that. I love what Arpit was just saying. For better or worse, I live in the future. So I'm thinking of the world of the year 2030, and I still hope I have some hair when we get there. In thinking about the world in 2030, remote workers will have a demand to live in places. Richard named Bozeman, named many places, and each of us has our own conception of the good life. Rani, I want to throw out there, There's also supply. We've seen in my mother-in-law's Berkeley, California, it's very hard to build housing there. So remote workers might want to move to Bozeman, but are they going to change their land use practices and to create, in the horrible language of economics, an inelastic housing supply curve, which in English means not building any housing? And so a very interesting issue, if I can be a two-handed economist, is there different strokes for different folks. People are going to demand to live in different areas, but I'm fascinated by which places will welcome these barbarians at the gate. And please put those words in quotes. And I think that that's going to be a key determinant of the new economic geography of our world. And I wanted to throw that out.
Adam, anything you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, I guess I'll stand up for struggling places a little bit, because I think that there's been a lot of sense in the discussions that most of the places that are going to benefit are going to tend to be either with the bounds of a city, you know, within 2 or 3 hours, or they're going to have some sort of like obviously desirable amenity in the sense that it's already like a vacation resort. But I think if you think about, you know, the country as a whole, and you think about what are the sort of factors that determine how desirable a place is to live. And if you take the jobs part of the equation and you zero that out and you look at what's left, places who were getting a, you know, negative effect from job access, they're going to see a relative increase in desirability, even if, you know, relatively speaking, they're not a great destination for other factors, but it moves them up. It makes them relatively more competitive. So I do think that even places who are, you know, not the superstar vacation towns, who might have more subtle amenities that are available, maybe it just means trails or like a kind of an okay downtown or something like that. I do think that they will see their relative competitiveness increase, and that should be a positive for their population trends. That doesn't mean that they're going to be the next Boise or Bozeman, but I do think it will be a help, and not just for people who are going to locate there, but for fewer people who are going to leave, because they don't necessarily have to move out of this place to have the same sort of career opportunities anymore. So I do think it will be a positive headwind or a tailwind for those struggling places as well.
Matt?
Yeah, so Ronnie, picking up on Adam's point, a plug for Baltimore. My Baltimore, located 40
I knew
miles.
we were going to talk about Baltimore. Thank you.
We're going to do it. Located 40 miles from Washington, D.C. And Baltimore has a wonderful housing stock priced on sometimes 65% cheaper than these DC brownstones. And so these beautiful row houses in Baltimore getting some oomph along the lines Adam was just saying, as power couples can park themselves in Baltimore and one of the spouses can sometimes go to DC. There's all these different permutations of how folks can set up their lives, and Baltimore will become stronger as an economy if it becomes a little bit of a suburb of DC for some couples. And so I think there's many exciting permutations.
Okay, so there's a few iterations here. People going to the suburbs, which is the most obvious one, people going to beautiful resort type destinations, and then people going to those places that have, as Adam put it, more like subtle things to offer, or going to Baltimore. Like there's like there is a draw, maybe not as obvious. I want to talk about the suburbs part of it, because that seems to be what's happening so far, at least for a large portion of people. What makes this different than, you know, every other generation's flight to the suburbs when you have kids and get older?
Well, that was coming down. So in the past, people did move to the suburbs after they got married and had kids. Increasingly, that has not been happening. People have actually been staying in cities and raising their kids in cities and, you know, living in small apartments with children. More amenities have popped up for children within downtown cities. But now what you may see more of, I mean, just broadly, you know, typically before the pandemic, about 80 to 90% of applications for any job came from within the same metro area. People, you know, geography was hugely important in the labor market. Employers discriminate against applicants who live more than sort of 15 miles away. They worry that they'll have car troubles and not make it to work on time. Geography was extremely important, and we're seeing that importance fall sort of across the board, with only about 60 to 70% of applications coming from within the same MSA now, and people clearly casting a much broader net and looking at jobs elsewhere. I think in many colleges, the thing to do after you graduate is move to Manhattan. So everyone from my college moved to Manhattan. It was just the thing you had to do. And increasingly, I think many people will stay with their parents a little longer, work remotely from the suburb where they can live for free rather than spending $3,000 a month on a closet. You may just see a whole lot more flexibility. And we're not really seeing such clear movements of applicants from this area to jobs in that area. That's not really what we're seeing quite so much. But we're seeing strange idiosyncratic patterns across the whole country, where people are just applying to jobs in different places and trying out their hands at places that they wouldn't otherwise have considered.
So as Matt put it, different strokes for different folks.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I think another thing that's been different is, even for the last few years, we've seen declining populations in some of the largest cities in the country. So I think that's been driven by a few different factors. So one is just the cost and expense of living in places like New York, where I am right now, has just gotten too high for many people, right? That reflects the NIMBY movement, the fact that we've made housing construction so difficult in many parts of the country. We have a lot of demographic headwinds as well, right? Even if young people prefer cities, we have fewer young people than we once did, and immigration has also been down. So cities are kind of feeling the effects of all these forces, and have been even before COVID. What the pandemic has brought is increased opportunities and potential for people to realize these preferences to an even higher degree, right? And so I think cities do kind of face important challenges to make sure they can continue to attract people in a context in which they're not necessarily offering a very affordable cost of living for people.
So you've had another existing trend of people leaving cities. It was already happening. Maybe the pandemic and just the ability to work from home now is going to accelerate that. Richard talked about this earlier, but that will fundamentally change the composition of who lives in cities, right? Or
yeah, and I think it's both people moving away from cities, as well as many people that are not moving to cities in the first place, right? So I think that's particularly strong with respect to immigration. So a city like New York used to constantly be replenished by new waves of immigrants who come in, and the domestic residents, move out somewhere else. I think, unfortunately, what we've seen for the last few years is, as immigrant flows have fallen, many of the immigrants who do come in, I think, are increasingly just heading straight directly to suburbs. And what that means is that there's really a lot of population that would have kind of moved to cities that we're not really seeing as much. And that's posing additional problems to how dynamic and vibrant cities can be.
I want to talk about this idea of agglomeration. It's a word that gets thrown out a lot when we're having these discussions. It's the idea that a certain city already has a concentration of this type of worker, this type of industry, this type of supply chain. It has everything there that you want. So that's going to, make it so that more people who are those type of workers in those type of industries with those type of supply chains gather there. When we were talking earlier, Arpit and a few others were trying to throw some water on that idea in the first place, like that you have to go to the place that's already important. Yeah, what are your thoughts about agglomeration?
I think so much of what we do in the labor market and everywhere isn't just to do with productivity and efficiency, right? A lot of these things are historical accidents, and they have to do with norms and signaling. And once there is some shock, there's something that jolts that model and forces people to sort of reconsider for a moment and to make a decision based on efficiency or productivity, you can actually see quite rapid changes. And I think that's happening here with remote work and with the location of companies. So once upon a time, if you were a big bank and you were a serious bank, you had to have your headquarters on Wall Street. Now we're seeing Goldman Sachs open an office in Palm Beach. We're seeing all of these, and then there was just during the pandemic, it started this chain of dominoes with all of these other financial companies saying, hey, we're going to open an office in Florida too. Everyone wants to move to Florida, we'll open offices there. And that's going to become the norm, the new norm. So we've seen this throughout history. even segregation in work and racial discrimination operated like this. There were many industrialists who wanted to hire Black workers, but if they did so, their white workers got really upset because they didn't want their friends to think that they did Black people's work. And the minute the law changed and they weren't allowed to discriminate anymore, the floodgates were opened and they could do what they wanted to do and what was more productive and efficient and economically sensible. And I think now you're going to have a lot of people sort of saying, wait a second, we don't all need to do this thing that's very expensive, that maybe had some productivity benefits from agglomeration, right? It is nice to have these chance encounters on the subway in New York and in San Francisco, but the productivity benefits are probably quite a bit smaller than many people chalked up. And much of the reason for what was happening was history, norms, and signaling.
Yeah, I just want to echo that point there from Julia. I think it's important to have an open mind about the presence of these agglomeration effects, exactly because it's so difficult to directly measure them, right? And it's really challenging to disentangle how much of these reflect the causal impact of the urban form on productivity, and how much of it is just really the background sorting of high-income workers and high productivity firms in dense areas. So the way I think about it is that these kind of agglomerative spillovers matter both within firms and across firms. Within firm, I think we've all had the experience that you're more productive if you work directly with other productive employees. But I think ultimately firms can internalize those kinds of spillovers and invest in the digital tools and technologies to foster within firm collaboration. Across firms, I think what's actually really important is the possibility of workers switching jobs, right? Software engineers live in San Francisco in part because it's easy to switch from working from Google to go to Facebook, right? So I think it's really crucial there to think about whether we can develop this nationwide talent pool, which will enable people to switch from one firm to the other. I think that's going to be the best guarantor of people's ability to command a market wage.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit onto that as well. I think that when we think about what agglomeration is, it's associated with bigger labor markets, and it would not take a significant share of the population to go remote in order for it to be the biggest labor market in the country. And so to the extent agglomeration exists, there's a good case to be made it's going to exist in this digital labor market. And we can already see some evidence of this on Upwork, in our digital labor market, where we help freelancers and businesses connect across the world and across the country. And we do see that a lot of clients are in high cost of living places, and the freelancers are in lower cost living places within the US. So think of the business in San Francisco who can't find programmers, and so they want to be able to access programmers all across the country. But we actually see, in addition, we see freelancers in higher cost living areas connect with clients in lower cost living areas. And that just shows you the importance of matching, right? So it's not just about like finding the lowest cost worker. It's also about finding people with scarce skills, people who don't have, they don't exist in your labor market. And you want that, that machine learning data scientist, you want that specific programmer, you want people with something that you can't get in your labor market. And when you connect to a digital labor market, you can get them. And so that ability to improve matches that comes with a digital remote labor market, I think is really important for spreading the benefits of agglomeration.
Rani, Julia, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we clearly see this in tech. Tech was, probably the industry most open to doing this. There are other industries that are far sort of stodgier, like law firms and banks. But I think even there, we're starting to see movements, and they're starting to learn about the benefits of remote work. And they really learned a lot during the pandemic. I spoke to someone who owns a law firm recently that had very expensive offices in Century City. And during the pandemic, they got rid of the office. And what they did was rent a small office space for each worker within walking distance from the lawyer's home. So each partner got an office down the street. The partners are all so much happier because they're close to their families. They can actually see their kids. And it's better for clients too. So now, because they have an office in Hollywood, and an office in Manhattan Beach, and an office in Redondo Beach, and an office in Hollywood, their clients have shorter commutes to meet with them. And they've actually found that this has opened up sort of a world of clients for them and improved convenience for clients. So, and it led to more minutes, more billable hours and more meetings. So I think this has been such a huge disruption that it's caused so many different kinds of firms to do things differently, to try them temporarily. They all said this will go on for 6 months, and they said 12 months. And now they're saying, wait a second, this saved us a fortune of money. It had all kinds of benefits that we didn't anticipate. Let's do this for the long haul.
Matt?
Rani, I want to come back to your question about agglomeration. Suppose that you are the mayor of Seattle and you've had a great decade with Amazon. You've admired Jeff Bezos's bald head. The money has flowed in from tax revenue. And now you hear that Amazon may be it's engaging in HQ2s, but also allowing remote work. I'm interested as an urban economist in two effects: the direct effect on your tax revenue as the mayor, but also if Adam has a startup where in 2012, he definitely would have moved to Seattle to be close to Amazon, to be a pilot fish next to that big whale. Does Adam now find Seattle much less sexy as a destination because the agglomeration of Amazon is attenuating? Or am I wrong? Something I'm interested in my own work is quality versus quantity of interaction. If Amazon employees only go to the mothership 2 days a week, are they going to be networking? Are they going to be there fewer hours, but will there be more interactions, substituting quality for quantity? And so as we think about the future of agglomeration, I think those are some key things to keep in mind.
Those are all great points. You mentioned, I think it was, as Julian mentioned, productivity, and I want to take a quick tangent because I think it deserves it. There was this the study that everyone cites was this one by Nicholas Bloom at Stanford. It was about Chinese travel agent, people working at a Chinese travel agency. And, he found that they were more productive when they worked from home, less likely to quit. Obviously, working from home during a global pandemic has its own set of issues that might be weighing in on this. But another study just came out from the University of Chicago. It's saying, people were actually less productive because they're working more hours and their output was about the same. So I was hoping either you guys would weigh in on like the productivity issue. Like, is it just like, of course, we're just as productive, who cares? Or is this still like a question? Because I know employers at least are very much considering this.
Oh, I'll jump in there. I think that it's important to think about the long run versus short run effects of productivity. Especially when you're forcing a lot of people to utilize remote work in a short-term response to the pandemic. Nobody, even the most optimistic, people who see a strong future for remote work, think that everyone who is remote during the pandemic is going to be remote long run. What's going to happen is firms and businesses are going to sort. The businesses for whom remote work is positive productivity or provides other benefits, they're going to stick with it. And the ones who it doesn't work with, they're not going to stick with it. Now, in my survey data and in Nick Bloom's survey data, whether we ask managers or employees, on average, think that productivity has gone up. And that's pretty astounding when you consider how involuntary this decision was for a lot of firms and how this selection effect that's going to contribute to productivity has not really kicked in yet. So each study is interesting in that it helps disentangle why remote work does or doesn't create productivity effects at various firms, but they're almost irrelevant. As long as productivity is being created at some firms, then it's going to be pro-productivity in the long run.
Some people have made a distinction between two types of productivity: so individual productivity and then team, collaborative, innovative productivity. And I think many of the studies show that individual productivity really goes up because people don't commute 2 hours a day. They can multitask. They can stick a load of laundry in, do a project, get up, stretch their legs, and sort of multitask in the household and be less exhausted. The other kind of productivity, I think, takes companies learning something and innovating, and I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I know that at ZipRecruiter, I think we did a fantastic job of keeping the company connected, of having weekly all-hands meetings. In fact, I think there's been far more transparency. People see more about the business metrics and business performance than they did before. They feel more included. We have lots and lots of Zoom calls and meetings where everyone's cameras on and we really are connecting with each other. And there's been a kind of intimacy in that connection too, because we're all inside each other's homes. We're all meeting each other's kids and dogs and spouses. It's actually been quite lovely. But I do hear from many friends who went to work at other places and started jobs remotely that they've found it extremely alienating, that the companies have done a terrible job of onboarding them, that they haven't known whom to ask about things, and they've been sitting on their own, flailing about, helplessly trying to solve problems with very complex data sets and, databases that they can't possibly figure out without help. And so I think there's a huge range of experiences across companies. And now is really the time for companies that are committing to remote work for the long haul to make an investment in documenting their procedures and encouraging, meetings on Zoom with cameras on so that people really do know each other and meet each other. That's all the organizational work that needs to take place. It requires leadership, it requires organization, it requires investment, all of those things.
Okay, I want to pivot a little bit to like physical space. I've been fascinated with how the move to remote work might change, just what we thought of as the office, what we thought of as, everyone has to go to New York City or to San Francisco and show up at this office, as different companies reconsider their office footprints, as, people might pick something like a WeWork or Industrious over a, big rented office. What happens to this office space? First of all, is this, a big enough of a change? Even if people are working remotely some of the time, they still might come into the office. Is this a big enough of a change that it's going to actually affect the physical office space? And if so, what happens to all that office space in cities?
Yeah, so I think this is a potentially really big factor here, right? So one thing to note is that even if we don't go fully remote, even if we adopt this hybrid model and people are in the office a few days a week, and to Julia's point, I think a little bit of in-person goes a long way with remote, right? Being able to have the occasional in-person meeting to mentor that kind of junior person in their organization really helps to make remote the other days a week work a lot better. But even if that's the form that remote work takes, that's still potentially a huge impact on our demand for physical space, because what that allows firms to do is a lot more of hot desking, right? So even a little bit of reduction in the time spent in office can potentially translate into large impacts on physical office space. And I think we're seeing that impact in when we look at leasing rates for office space, when we look at the market price of commercial office REITs. So I think this is potentially a big shock to this whole sector. And another challenge is it's not obvious how to redevelop this space, right? So the way modern office buildings are constructed, it's not really easy to convert them into residential units, which would be the most natural use of space. It's a lot easier to convert hotels, for example, into residential space. So I think we will have kind of this big stranded asset of large scale office buildings in Midtown, in San Francisco. And I think it will be a challenge to figure out what's the best way of redeveloping this space.
Would anyone else want to weigh in on like the physical space, or, whether WeWork now has a big chance? I in my own reporting, I just found that I thought that was so interesting that like a company that I thought, or companies like WeWork, where, everyone was crammed into a small amount of space, I was making these predictions of like, oh, how could they possibly exist? And now they seem to be in demand again. So just interesting.
What's fascinating to me is going to be that, WeWork's a company that concentrated in a lot of big cities and urban areas and urban downtowns. And it seems like what we're really going to need is a lot of co-working spaces in suburban areas and co-working spaces and even in rural areas. And that's kind of an interesting challenge because you sort of have a minimum scale you need to get over in those rural areas, suburban areas. So I think we're going to see some interesting business models arise there.
Got it. So I'm going to open this up to just a couple of questions that we've had posted by attendance. One of them is are cost of living debates still part of the quote Bill of Rights, or can talented New York City employees still get like the same salary and work in a rural area? Or do you have to, take the and this is me, take the Facebook sort of, you get paid less if you go move somewhere where the cost of living is less?
So I do have a little bit of research on this where we were able to look at what happens to pay with Upwork, because we do, like I mentioned earlier, connect a lot of clients in high cost of living places with freelancers in lower cost of living places in the US. And what we found right now is that pay tends to be in the middle. So it's below the high cost of living, what the businesses are paying. It's above the low cost of living, what the freelancers would otherwise be earning. So it provides a win-win. Now, what happens in the long run equilibrium remains to be seen, but I think that's what's important. There's the opportunity for a win-win. The other thing to consider is that these are not these are not low-skilled workers in generally. There's a strong positive correlation between education and income and ability to go remote, and that creates a lot of bargaining power. And this is not typically the kind of workers that we worry about lack of bargaining power with their firm. So I think that they're going to be able to get what they, they're going to be able to capture some of that value.
I love this idea of income arbitrage. I have another question from the audience. We talked a lot about people going to the suburbs, people going to resort destinations within the US, but is there an international remote market?
Rani, I've been interested in that in the European Union. So if I have an aging French mother and I'm French, can I work for a German firm while remaining in France? And so I'm interested in this best of both worlds and of having links to one's family and one's culture. So in the European Union, I see it. Throw this back to the panel for the gains in well-being around the world.
Yeah, I think this market is still just really developing. But one thing I just want to flag as being potentially important is time zone adjacency, right? So there are a lot of tasks that firms are doing that they kind of need people to be working at the same time. And we've seen a lot of synchronous tools like Zoom and Slack develop for this purpose. I think there's going to be even more development of tools that enable people to be collaborating real time with each other. And that kind of demands people that they may not be in the same country, but they would ideally be in the same time zone. And so I think there's a possibility there for, for the United States in particular with Latin American countries, where you do have some time zone adjacency that they could potentially become integrated into a larger international labor force.
That would be so interesting. Yeah, if you didn't, you could move to a bunch of different places as long as it's in the same time zone. It's fascinating. Did anyone else want to weigh in on that? I mean, I imagine a lot of this, as we said earlier, is going to be a wait and see. We have to see where this shakes out, where you're allowed to go. I could probably talk about this with you smart people all day, but our time is running out. So I'm going to hand this over to Adam, who's going to close it out.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I was really excited to get all these experts together and hear all the different great perspectives on this. And thanks to Rani as well, and EIG and Upwork, and everyone in the audience too. I think it's we're really in early days on this question. And, we're just starting to see the mobility of people. And so how remote work affects place is definitely going to be a topic of growing interest. And it's important to keep our minds open. It's important to think big and to not think about sort of short-term, narrow issues, and think about the really transformative potential here. And, the international question is a really interesting one as well. And I would push people to, to try to bring a little bit more optimism to this topic, because I think that, it's not just about, remote work is not just about finding the lowest cost of living places and hiring people from there. That is by itself already a tremendous amount of potential, especially if you're talking within a country where we've seen massive cost of living increases as people move to superstar cities. That's really important. But it's also about providing access to people with skills that aren't in your local labor market. And this has a lot of potential for US workers and developing countries as well. The US is on net an exporter of service industries. And so if access to remote workers was just going to be only about hiring the lowest cost and the hiring of lowest cost living places, you wouldn't see that. But the U.S. has a lot of skilled workers. We have some of the most skilled workers in the country. And I think if you think about the potential for developing income countries to access skilled workers in this country to help push their companies forward, help move productivity forward, help move growth forward, it's a whole other side of the coin here. So that's the kind of things I think we need to think broadly about. So I'll close with that, and thank everybody for showing up here and listening to us all.
Thanks so much, Adam. And just echoing that, thank you so much to Upwork for partnering with us on the Rise of Remote series. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists and moderators for sharing your time and your expertise. As we mentioned, the webinar was recorded, so we'll post the recording and a brief recap on our website soon. I know a few questions trickled in that we weren't able to get to, so we'll try to answer those there. And we hope you'll join us for our next event in our Rise of Remote series on Wednesday, June 30th, which will be focused on revitalizing the heartland, public policy planning for the rise of remote. We look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks so much and have a great day.